There's often a reason why a lot of people don't see stability in their advertising. Some of those are outside circumstances, but a lot of times, the most people that I've seen recently is because they're missing this one really key principle with how meta ads work. There's often a reason why people don't get stability in their ad account. Now, stability, what I don't mean is you're gonna have cheap CPAs, because that is a totally different factor, but I mean stability in that your consistency in the CPAs or cost per purchase you're getting is not stable and consistent. And there's typically one underpinning reason why for the majority of brands that I see that happen to. And I want to reveal that to you. It is the learning phase. You probably know what that is, but I can promise you, you probably don't think about it in this way. And that's where people fail, what they get wrong, is you need to understand what it means, the implications of it as well, but then also what creates those issues. So let me explain what I mean. This concept is very critical because this is where stability from the meta ads come from. We have some brands that come to us that they're spending $15,000 a month and their cost per purchase is all over the place. One day it's $100, the next day it's $30, the day after that it's $70. Whereas we have other brands that they're spending $80,000 a month and the CPA has been pretty much the same for the last 6 months, give or take $5 up or down. And that is because they understand the learning phase and they're using that to their advantage. So the reason I'm gonna talk about this quite deeply is because it's the underpinning theory with how we run our accounts, because we want the most amount of data to go through the fewest amount of ad sets at all times to create stability. If you're the type of person that you're launching new campaigns and ad sets all the freaking time, that's why things aren't going to be stable for you, is you want stability, and that only comes through getting out of the learning phase. So let me explain what that is. So the learning phase is what Meta uses to tell you if you have optimized the ad set. So an optimization does not mean the most amount of purchases or the cheapest purchases. It just means that their learning model has reached enough data and significance and enough volume of data to create stability. So what that means is if you can get out of that phase, typically what that means is the CPAs you're getting are the baseline. Now you can test new creative to make those cheaper potentially on new offers or landing pages, but what that means is you're reaching more of a stable state. And that's why we really look at how much budget are we putting behind ad sets to guarantee at least 50 conversions in 7 days. Now for smaller brands, I know that's hard. You have to do the best that you can. But for a lot of brands, that's actually quite easy. And so that theory is important because that is where stability comes from. When you first launch a campaign or an ad set, typically you're going to get the cheapest cost per purchases you're ever going to get when you first launch, because Meta's going to go after the lowest hanging fruit. And then over time, you're going to find those CPAs start to increase, but with enough budget, they stabilize. Now, stabilize again does not mean the cheapest. What it means is you reach enough data, spend behind it, that the learning AI behind Meta knows it can get more of those people at a stable CPA or somewhat stable. So for example, just in this graph, the more conversions you get, they're typically cheaper, but then the more you spend in that 7-day period and you're getting 50 conversions in that 7 days, you'll find your CPAs become a bit more consistent. So they're going to be less volatile. You're not going to have massive swings, $200 one day, $10 the next day. It's going to be more consistent. That's what we're looking for. And for our brands that we scale, that is why things are quite stable, is because we use this to our advantage. We want to make sure we have enough budget going behind the fewest amount of ad sets as possible. Now, I'm not saying only one or two. Sometimes there's use cases where we have a bit more, but we want the most amount of budget going through behind the fewest amount of ad sets to create that stable state. But I want to demystify a few things. Is if you go to your account overview for a Meta ad account, you can actually look at the account summary right here. And it tells you for how much money you've spent, what's the average percentage of spend that is being spent in the learning phase. What that tells you is how much budget you're spending in that time period that's not out of the learning phase. And so typically what Meta engineers have told us is that you want to shoot for 20% or less. Because what that means is if 20% of your less of your budget is being spent on like new ad sets or changes to ad sets, what that means is the majority of your account, in this case 80%, is fully optimized and quite stable. And that's why typically you want to go with what we call the minimum viable funnel, the fewest amount of campaigns or ad sets needed to hit those business objectives. But then when you have other accounts like here, for example, and so the learning phase here is the estimated percentage of money spent on your ads that have the learning limited status. Now, we've noticed recently that some campaigns get out of the learning phase before 50 conversions. I think Meta's working on their probabilistic targeting here and their modeling, but you still want to make sure the fewest amount of campaigns or ad sets are in the learning limited or not out of the learning phase. So there's changes that create this. So typically any change to a campaign or an ad set that's significant brings them back into the learning phase. Those are things like, for example, a budget change, depending on the magnitude. So typically if it's quite minimal, and that's why some people say live by the 20% per day or 20% per week, so it doesn't change that. But campaign can create an ad set to go out of the learning phase. Meta is quite close-lipped on how big of that jump needs to be. Also, the bid amount can get you outside the learning phase. Targeting, placements, optimization event, adding new creative, bid strategy, bid amount, budget, even pausing for long periods of time. That's why you just have to be really careful when you are making changes. And that's why we make very few changes. Instead, we like to focus on changes over a longer period of time so that we have the most amount of budget going behind that. So keep that in mind. Now, a few things you need to understand as well is there's a formula we use. There's a formula you can use to determine how many ad sets do I need with my budget to make sure that I get them out of the learning phase. So let's say, for example, your CPA was $50 and you want to get 50 conversions in a week, right? To make sure it gets out of the learning phase and stays without it. So that means you want to spend about $2,500 per week, which is about $357 per day. So that equals about $10,800 per month. Follow me so far? So following this methodology, 50 conversions I need in a 7-day period would work out like this. Here's a formula. Take your number of max optimized ad sets, so monthly ad budget divided by your CPA divided by 200. So in this example, if your CPA is $60, and my monthly budget is $25,000, then using that formula, $25,000 divided by my CPA divided by 200 means 2.8. So what that means is I really only have enough budget to make sure 2 ad sets in my account stay outside the learning phase. Now, I'm not saying this is the blanket rule, it's gonna make all of your campaigns perform better, but what you will notice is significantly greater stability and less volatility. Now, there's other situations where you can change that, but this is to give you a directional idea, a directional rule of the number of ad sets to stay within to keep things out of the learning phase as much as possible. So a few things to understand. Just by getting learning limited does not mean bad performance, meaning you now have enough data behind it, and so your ad campaigns are now in learning limited. It does not mean it's gonna be bad performance. It just, again, it's for the modeling to better predict your CPAs, but does not mean learning limited. Also understand is, once you get out of the learning phase, it doesn't mean you're gonna have instant success. There's a lot of campaigns that we have that are out of the learning phase and we're not happy with the CPAs. Again, just because out of the learning phase does not mean you're gonna get the CPAs that you want. It just means it's gonna be stability within that system you've created already. So that's a really great time to then let's introduce new ads to it to try to get that CPA down. And when that gets out of the learning phase, can our CPAs come down overall? Because once you get to 50 conversions, just to be clear, it doesn't mean everything's hunky-dory. It doesn't mean it's a magic number that everything just turns around, everything just starts happening. Again, because Meta is looking at your campaign, your ads that you're targeting in your ad. Within that ecosystem, it means it's out of the learning phase and you can expect better stability. But if you're not happy with performance, then that means you have to test new variables, ads or targeting, but majority of the time new ads, to try to get that CPA down. And that's just part of your testing process. So when you are thinking about following this process and consolidating down your ad account, just realize the changes I mentioned a few moments ago, those reset the learning phase. So typically that's why testing is just a necessary evil, but then once you reach that stable state, you want to spend as much budget behind as possible. That's why, for example, if you follow our account structure I mentioned in previous videos, that's why we try to push the most amount of budget behind a scaling campaign, one ad set, and winners in that campaign, so that campaign, that ad set are always out of the learning phase. That is the whole point of why we do that. So some takeaways you should take away from the learning phase is to have the most amount of stability as possible. You want to have the MVP, minimum viable funnel. What's the fewest amount of campaigns and ad sets you need to funnel the most budget behind those? To be honest with you, for brands that are spending over 50K or 60K a month, you have to really think about that. But for brands that are spending 6 figures a month or more, they're spending so much money, it's quite easy with every new campaign or ad set you launch to get that 50 conversions in a week. And so for them, it's a different ball game. But for brands spending under that amount, you really need to stress this because again, like I said, that's where stability comes from. Now, I don't know about you, but a lot of our brands want to know what is a CPA that we can rely on that's stable, and then we'll test an experiment to get that CPA down or be okay with that CPA because we can bundle things together and just make more profit overall. I know this is a deep topic, but this is a core foundation of understanding to really crush at meta ads. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'll see you guys in the next video.